John had always preferred the quiet of the wilderness to the noise of settlements. A rugged man, in his late 30s, he had lived alone for years, traveling across forests and plains as a scout and trader. His life wasn't filled with many friends, and he liked it that way. He found peace in the solitude of nature, away from the complicated and often harsh realities of human society. It was a bright, early morning when John first saw her. He was on his usual route, walking along a familiar trail near a small, scattered settlement on the edge of the woods. His boots crunched lightly on the dried leaves and twigs beneath his feet as he made his way through the trees. He was a man used to the sounds of nature birds singing, the wind whispering through the leaves, and the distant rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. But today, something felt different. The peaceful quiet was disturbed by raised voices. It was not the usual sounds of a group of settlers or traders. It was the harsh, angry tone of a crowd, coming from deeper in the woods. Curious but cautious, John decided to investigate. He moved silently, his years of experience in the wilderness allowing him to tread lightly, unseen by the people who were making the noise. As he neared a clearing, he could see a small group of people standing in a circle. The men, women, and elders of a nearby native tribe were gathered around something or someone. John's gaze shifted, and his heart sank as he saw the young girl in the center. She looked to be no older than 14, with long, black hair that was tangled and messy. Her clothes were simple, made of furs and cloth, and she was standing with her head bowed, her hands tied together in front of her. The tribe's elders stood around her, their faces stern and unforgiving. They were talking to her in a language John couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. She was being reprimanded for something serious. John had seen these kinds of tribal punishments before they were a part of the harsh customs many tribes held onto. In some cases, they were meant to teach a lesson, to maintain order and respect, but this situation felt different. The girl's shoulders were slumped, her body trembling, and the look in her eyes was one of sheer fear. She was young, too young to be subjected to something so harsh. John's instincts told him that something wasn't right. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the leaves. The noise caught the attention of the group, and they all turned to look at him. A few of the elders frowned, their eyes narrowing. But John's presence was known in these parts. He had traded with their people before, and though they were wary of outsiders, they respected him. He had earned that respect over the years, and it worked in his favor today. "I need to speak with the girl," John said in a calm but firm voice. His words were simple, but the weight of his request was clear. He didn't ask for permission. He simply stated what he intended to do. The elders exchanged looks, murmurs passing between them. They had always followed their traditions, and those traditions had rules about how to deal with transgressions. But John was a man of influence in this region, and they hesitated. After a long pause, one of the elders, a man with deep wrinkles etched on his face, nodded. "She has broken our laws," the elder said, his voice thick with authority. "She must be punished." "I understand," John replied, his voice unwavering. "But she's just a child. There must be another way." The air grew tense as John stepped closer to the girl. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she flinched as he approached, as if she expected more punishment. John crouched down, looking at her with a soft expression. He wasn't a healer, but he had dealt with injuries in his years on the trail, and he could tell she was hurt, physically and emotionally. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle. The girl didn't respond at first, but her eyes shifted toward him, a flicker of hope breaking through the fear. She nodded slowly, but the silence between them hung heavy. John knew the seriousness of the situation. If he didn't act, things could escalate quickly. He turned to the elders, his tone more forceful now. "This punishment isn't the answer. She needs care, not more pain. Let me take her away from here, and I will make sure she understands whatever wrong she has done. But I won't stand by and watch her suffer like this." The group was silent. John knew it was a bold move, but he also knew it was the right one. After what seemed like an eternity, the elder who had first spoken nodded again, albeit reluctantly. "You may take her," the elder said, his voice heavy. "But understand this, you are not one of our people. You do not know our ways. Do not think your actions will change anything for her in the long run." John nodded, accepting the elder's words. He wasn't there to challenge their customs. He was only there to ensure this girl didn't pay a higher price than she deserved. With careful hands, John untied the girl's hands. He helped her to her feet, gently guiding her away from the group. She was still shaking, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes as she walked beside him. As they moved away from the group, John couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had done what he felt was right. But he knew the elders wouldn't forget this. There might be consequences for his actions, but he had to hope that it was worth it. Once they were a safe distance away from the group, John led the girl to a small stream that ran nearby. He sat her down by the water, offering her some food and water. She hesitated at first, but after a moment, she accepted. Her hands were trembling as she drank, and John noticed that her eyes still held a mix of fear and uncertainty. "You're safe now," John said, his voice soft. "No one will hurt you here." Soft. The girl looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to understand him. She didn't speak at first, and John didn't push her. Instead, he sat down next to her, quietly watching the stream as the water flowed by. Both of them were simply trying to understand the situation and what would come next. John knew he had made a difference today. The girl, though still fearful, had been spared from further harm. But what would happen to her now? What consequences would she face when she returned to her people? Would they see this as an act of mercy? Or would they view it as an offense? Only time would tell. But for now, all that mattered was that she was safe. And for the first time, John allowed himself to relax. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. John sat quietly by the stream, his eyes occasionally flicking over to the girl beside him. She was still very much in shock. Her small hands clutched tightly around the bowl of water he had given her. She drank slowly, as if each sip took a great deal of effort. Her face, though still marked by the fear of the ordeal, began to relax a little, as if she was starting to understand that the immediate danger had passed. John, a man of few words, knew that the silence between them was necessary. The world around them was calm, but the events that had just transpired were anything but peaceful. He glanced up at the trees, their leaves swaying gently in the cool breeze. The quiet of the forest surrounded them, offering a small but precious sense of security. This moment, away from the chaos of the tribe, felt like a brief refuge. The girl, whom John had learned was named Ayanna, shifted uncomfortably beside him. Her eyes were downcast, avoiding his gaze. But every now and then, she would glance up at him, as if she couldn't quite believe he was there, that someone had actually stepped in to help her. John's heart softened at the sight. She was so young, and yet, she had already been forced to face things no child should ever have to. He took a slow breath, unsure of what to say. The situation was delicate. He had intervened in something that was not just a matter of physical punishment, but also an issue deeply tied to culture and tradition. John was an outsider to these people's ways, and though he had earned their respect, there was always the risk that they would not look kindly upon his interference. But that was a problem for another time. For now, Ayanna needed care and comfort, not judgment. John reached into his pack and pulled out some dried meat and bread. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He handed the food to Ayanna, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. "Eat," he said simply, his voice calm. You need to regain your strength. Ayana hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting his, searching his face. Her expression was uncertain, as though she was not used to being shown kindness, or maybe not used to receiving it in such a genuine way. She took the food from him slowly, her hands trembling slightly. But once she started eating, she did so eagerly, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. John watched her quietly, his mind turning. He had to admit, he didn't know much about the girl's life before today. She had never spoken of her family, her tribe, or even what had led to the punishment. John had assumed that in the wilds of the forest, his role would be to protect, to help when needed. But he had never anticipated being thrown into the heart of a tribal conflict. Still, his conscience told him he had done the right thing. No one, especially a child, should be treated with such cruelty. After some time, Ayana finished her meal. And for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of unspoken emotions. Thank you, she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes but acknowledging his kindness. John didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what he could say. You're welcome, he said, eventually, his voice low. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. No one should ever be treated like that. Ayana nodded, though her face remained distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. She pulled her knees up to her chest, hugging them tightly, as if trying to protect herself from the memories that must have been swirling inside her. John could only guess at what she had gone through. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. John gave her space to process, allowing her the time she needed. He understood that the weight of what she had experienced couldn't just disappear. It would take time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, John decided it was time to move. We can stay here for the night, he said, standing and brushing the dirt off his pants. But it'll be better if we find a place to sleep before it gets too dark. Ayana didn't respond immediately, but when John began to gather his things, she followed him, her small footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. They walked through the trees, the ground beneath their feet now colder as the evening air began to settle in. John led the way, his mind still racing with questions. But he didn't press Ayana to talk. He knew that for now, her silence was a kind of defense mechanism, a way of coping with the overwhelming emotions she must have been feeling. They reached a small cave about an hour later, a place John had often used as shelter when traveling through the region. It was simple, with enough space for the two of them to sleep comfortably. The walls of the cave were cool and smooth, offering shelter from the chilly night air. John started a small fire in the center, the warmth slowly spreading across the cave. And Ayana sat down near the fire, her back against the wall. John unpacked the few things he had brought with him, setting up a simple bedroll for both of them. This will be fine for the night, he said, glancing at Ayana. She nodded, still quiet. She had not shown much emotion since the rescue, but John could sense the exhaustion in her. She was worn out, mentally and physically. He only hoped that she would find some peace, even for a few hours. The fire crackled softly, filling the cave with a gentle warmth. John sat across from Ayana, watching her closely. You've been through a lot today, he said after a long pause. I don't know what your people expected, but you're safe here now. I won't let anything happen to you. Ayana's eyes met his for the briefest moment, and John saw something flicker there, something he hadn't seen before, a glimmer of trust. It was faint, but it was there. The hours passed in quiet conversation, John offering Ayana simple comforts and reassurance. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the sounds of the forest outside the cave were distant and calming. As the night grew deeper, John couldn't help but wonder about the girl's future. What would happen to her now? Would her tribe accept the punishment he had prevented? Would they see it as an insult to their customs? He knew that he had made a bold choice, and one that might have far-reaching consequences. But for now, he didn't worry about that. The girl beside him, still so young, needed him. She needed comfort. She needed to heal. And John, for the first time in a long time, was willing to stay, to help her. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, Ayanna had finally fallen asleep, curled up in her blanket. John stayed awake a while longer, watching over her. The weight of the day's events pressing on him. He couldn't change everything, but he had changed this moment. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, the sun broke through the trees with a soft glow, gently lighting up the cave where John and Ayanna had spent the night. The crackling fire had long since faded into glowing embers, and the cold morning air made the cave feel smaller and quieter than it had the night before. John woke early, as he always did, stretching his limbs and adjusting to the stillness of the early hours. He quietly stood up, careful not to wake Ayanna. She had slept soundly, her small frame wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. Her face peaceful in sleep, though her features still carried the faint shadows of worry. John had been unable to shake the thoughts that had kept him awake the previous night. What would happen now? Was it truly enough to intervene and offer the girl safety? Or would she face even more consequences when she returned to her people? John spent a few minutes gathering his things and preparing for the day ahead. He didn't have much with him, only the essentials: a knife, some dried meat, a flint, and a few other basic items needed for survival in the wild. Ayanna had eaten sparingly the night before, and John hoped she would be ready for more food soon, though he knew she was still recovering emotionally from everything that had happened. As he turned to pack his things, he heard the soft sound of movement behind him. He turned to find Ayanna, slowly sitting up, her dark eyes looking around in the dim light of the morning. For a moment, she seemed unsure, as if she were still processing the events of the previous day. John offered her a warm smile. "Good morning," he said gently, his voice low to avoid startling her. Ayanna blinked, her eyes focusing on him. She gave a small nod in response but didn't speak. The silence stretched between them for a few moments, the weight of the previous day still lingering in the air. John gathered the last of his things and packed them away. When he turned back to Ayanna, she was sitting up straighter, her eyes now looking at him with a sort of quiet intensity, a determination that had been missing the day before. "I have to go back," she said suddenly, her voice soft but firm. Her words caught John off guard, and he paused in his movements, watching her closely. "Go back where?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "To my people," Ayanna replied, not looking at him but instead staring ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. "They'll come looking for me. I can't stay here." John took a deep breath, understanding what she meant. He had expected this moment to come, but hearing the words spoken out loud still felt like a weight settling in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had expected, perhaps that Ayanna would choose to stay with him, to find a new path away from the tribe. But that was not the reality of her life. She was bound to her people, her culture, and the rules of that world, even if those rules had hurt her. "Ayanna," John began, his voice softer now. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to. You don't owe them anything. Not after what happened." But Ayanna shook her head, cutting him off before he could say more. "I do owe them," she said quietly, her voice full of a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "They're my family. Even if they're harsh, I am part of them. I can't just run away. I have to face what happened." John stood still for a moment, watching her closely. He had seen this before, in the eyes of those who were torn between duty and personal desire. It wasn't easy to break free from the bonds of family, community, and tradition. Even though Ayanna had been wronged, she still felt bound by the weight of her heritage, her responsibilities. "You're very brave," John said, his voice full of admiration. "I can understand why you feel that way." But I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone. If you need help, if you want to leave, I'll do what I can." Ayana met his eyes for the first time since the night before, her gaze steady. She smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know you mean well," she said quietly. "But this is something I have to do. I've made my choice." John felt a pang of sadness in his chest, but he didn't press her further. He could see that Ayana had made up her mind, and while he wished she could choose a different path, he knew he couldn't force her to stay. Sometimes, people had to follow their own course, no matter how difficult it was. "I understand," John said softly. "I'll help you as much as I can. But the decision is yours to make." Ayana nodded, looking relieved that he wasn't trying to convince her otherwise. "Thank you, John," she said, her voice softer now. "I'll always remember what you did for me." With that, she stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her clothes. John stood as well, packing the last of his things. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Her tribe would be looking for her, and though John didn't know exactly when they would arrive, he had a sense that it wouldn't be long before they found their way to the cave. It was a peaceful place, but it wasn't going to keep them hidden forever. "I'll walk with you part of the way," John offered, his tone more practical now, as he adjusted the strap of his pack. "At least until we reach a place where you'll be safe." Ayana hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that," she said softly. They left the cave together, walking in silence for the first part of the journey. John was acutely aware of the quiet tension between them, the unspoken understanding that they were nearing the end of their time together. He knew he wouldn't be able to walk beside her for much longer. The path she had chosen was one she would have to face alone. As they walked through the forest, the sounds of the wilderness enveloped them. Birds sang in the trees, and the wind rustled the leaves above them. But for John, the world felt muted. His mind was elsewhere, thinking of what would happen once Ayana returned to her people. Would they welcome her back? Would they be angry at her for being saved by an outsider? They didn't speak much during the journey, but every now and then, Ayana would glance at him, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for her bravery, for the strength she had shown. She had faced so much, and now she was walking back to face even more. As the day wore on, the forest began to thin out, and the path started to wind back toward the area where Ayana's tribe would likely be. The air felt heavier here, as if the weight of what was about to happen hung in the balance. At a small clearing, Ayana stopped and turned to John. "This is as far as I can go," she said quietly. John nodded, a sad smile on his face. "I'll leave you here," he said softly. "But remember, if you ever need help, if things go wrong, you can find me." Ayana smiled, her expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you for everything, John," she said, her voice sincere. "You've done more for me than I can ever repay." John placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a small, reassuring squeeze. "Take care of yourself, Ayana. I hope things work out for you." With that, she turned and walked back toward her people, leaving John standing alone in the clearing, watching her disappear into the distance. He didn't know what the future held for her, but he hoped with all his heart that she would be okay. The days following Ayana's departure were quieter than John had hoped. After she had left, he found himself walking through the woods with a heavy heart. There was a sense of emptiness in the air that hadn't been there before. The days felt longer now, and each step he took seemed slower, weighed down by the uncertainty of what was happening to Ayana. He had done what he could. He had offered her the safety of his camp, a refuge from her people's harsh customs, and had tried to provide her with the comfort she needed. But now, she was back with them, facing whatever consequences awaited her. John couldn't help but wonder if she would ever return, or if this was the last time he would see her. John spent his days as he always had, traveling the land, making the occasional trade with local settlers and native tribes. But everything seemed distant. His thoughts kept returning to Ayanna, to the girl he had tried to protect, but who was now on her own, back in the midst of her tribe's customs. One morning, as John was preparing his camp for another journey, he heard something unusual. It was a faint rustling in the bushes, followed by the sound of footsteps. At first, he thought it was an animal, or perhaps a traveler passing through. But as the figure stepped out from behind a tree, his heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of him, was Ayanna. She looked different, more mature somehow. Her eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, now seemed steadier, though they still carried the weight of everything she had endured. Her clothes were clean but worn, and her posture had changed. She no longer seemed like the scared girl he had rescued. Now, she stood tall, her shoulders squared, her face calm, but serious. "Ayanna," John said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. "What are you doing here?" I thought you had gone back to your people." Ayanna gave a small nod, her lips pressed together as if trying to find the right words. "I did go back," she said quietly. "But things aren't as I expected." John's heart tightened at her words. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low with concern. He had feared that her return would be difficult, but hearing her confirm it was worse than he had imagined. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her eyes meeting his. "When I came back, I thought it would be easy. I thought that if I returned and apologized, they would accept me, that everything would go back to normal. But it didn't." John listened intently, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He could see that Ayanna was struggling, that the weight of whatever had happened was still pressing on her, making her words harder to say. "They weren't happy with me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said I had shamed my family, that I had dishonored our traditions. They were angry that I had been saved by someone outside the tribe." Ayanna looked down at her hands, as if trying to gather strength from the earth beneath her feet. "They said I was weak, that I had failed them." John could feel the anger rising within him at her words. He couldn't understand how a family, a community, could treat someone so young with such coldness, especially after what she had been through. "Ayanna," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you did what you had to do. You weren't weak. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known." Ayanna's eyes flickered to him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Thank you," she said softly, but the sadness in her eyes lingered. "But they didn't see it that way. They made me leave." John's heart sank as he processed her words. "Made you leave?" he repeated, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "But you're still part of their people. You're still their family." Ayanna nodded slowly, her face hardening with determination. "I am their family, but I don't belong there anymore." Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied herself. "I couldn't stay. Not with the way they saw me. Not with the shame they placed on me for something that wasn't my fault." John didn't know what to say. He could feel the weight of her words, the depth of her pain. He had known that Ayanna's return to her tribe would be complicated, but he hadn't realized just how difficult it would be for her. It broke his heart to see her standing there, so brave, but so broken. "I couldn't stay," she said again, more firmly now. "I had to leave. And so, I came back to you." John didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder, offering her the comfort he knew she desperately needed. "You're welcome here, Ayanna. You can stay as long as you need to. You don't have to face this alone." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as if testing whether or not he truly meant them. After a long moment, she nodded. "Thank you, John," she said, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." she said. John gave her a reassuring smile, though he knew the road ahead for both of them was uncertain. But for now, that didn't matter. She was safe. She had made a choice to seek out the person who had shown her kindness, who had saved her from a punishment that wasn't right. She had returned not to escape, but to find a way forward. "You don't need to thank me," John said, his voice sincere. "You've shown me more courage than anyone I know." They stood in silence for a few moments, the forest around them still and calm, as if it, too, was giving them a moment to process everything that had happened. The tension between them had softened, and a new kind of understanding seemed to have blossomed in the air. Finally, John spoke again, his voice practical, yet soft. "We can make camp here for the night. I'll gather some food, and we'll figure out what to do from there. But right now, it's important that you rest." Ayanna nodded, and though her face was still clouded with sadness, there was a faint spark of something else in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, of trust. She hadn't given up. She had made a choice, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she had found someone she could rely on. John was that person, and for the first time since they had met, he felt certain that he could offer her the kind of protection she needed, not just for the moment, but for as long as she was willing to accept it. As John began preparing their small camp, Ayanna sat nearby, watching him, but also lost in her thoughts. It was clear that she was still processing everything, her place in the world, her connection to her family, and her future. But there was one thing John knew for sure. Ayanna wasn't alone anymore. She had found a place to belong, even if it wasn't with her people. And that, John thought, was enough for now. The days passed slowly, in the quiet of the forest. With each passing moment, John could feel the weight of Ayanna's presence beside him. It was as if the air itself had changed since she had arrived. There was a gentle comfort in her company, a calmness that hadn't been there before. For the first time in years, John felt like he wasn't just passing through life, he was sharing it with someone. Ayanna had become more than just a girl he had rescued. She had become someone he cared for deeply. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the quiet between them began to feel heavier. John knew something had to change. Though Ayanna was safe, there were still questions that lingered in the air, things they both avoided talking about. Her return to the tribe had been a difficult choice, one that had not gone as she had hoped. The shame she had felt from being sent away was still fresh, and it made her distant at times, as if she was still unsure of where she belonged. It was early one morning when Ayanna finally broke the silence. She had been quiet the whole night, as she often was, and John had noticed her restlessness. He had been waiting for her to speak, to share what was troubling her, but he hadn't expected her words to come so soon. "I can't stay here forever, John," Ayanna said quietly as she sat by the fire. The sound of her voice seemed to cut through the stillness of the morning, the weight of her words sinking in immediately. "I've been thinking a lot, and I think it's time for me to go back." John's heart tightened at her words. He knew this moment would come, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. He had hoped that Ayanna might find some peace in his company, that maybe she could stay with him, build a new life away from the customs of her tribe. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't his decision to make. Ayanna's heart, her sense of identity, was tied to her people, no matter the pain she had faced. "You don't have to go back, Ayanna," John said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't want to lose her, didn't want her to walk away from the safety they had built. "You've already been through so much. You don't owe them anything." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes calm but firm. "I don't owe them anything, no. But I owe myself the chance to face my past. I can't keep running away from it. I need to know if I can go back on my terms, to make peace with what happened." John felt a deep ache in his chest as he listened to her. He understood. He knew the feeling of wanting to confront the past, to take control of your own story. But even so, He couldn't help the pang of sadness that spread through him. He had grown so fond of Ayanna in the short time they had spent together. The thought of her leaving, of going back to a place where she was not fully accepted, left him with a feeling of helplessness. "I'll go with you," John said, surprising even himself. His words were out before he had a chance to fully think them through. The idea of walking with Ayanna, supporting her as she returned to her tribe, felt right in some way. Even if it seemed like an impossible thing to do. Ayanna blinked at him, as if the offer had caught her off guard. "John, you don't have to. This is something I need to do alone." "I know," John replied, his voice steady. "But I can't just leave you to face it alone. You don't have to go back by yourself. Not after everything that's happened." For a moment, there was silence between them. Ayanna stared at the ground, her brow furrowed as she thought about his words. Finally, she looked up at him, her gaze softening. "I appreciate it," she said quietly. "But I don't think it's your place to be there with me. I have to do this on my own. It's not about what they think of me anymore. It's about what I think of myself." John nodded slowly, understanding at last. He had always known this moment would come. And he had known that Ayanna had to make her own choices, even if it meant walking away from the safety and peace he had offered her. He had given her a chance to heal, to regain her sense of self, but now it was time for her to move forward. They sat together for a while, both of them lost in thought. The fire crackled softly between them, the quiet of the forest pressing in around them. John couldn't help but wonder what would become of Ayanna after she left. Would she be accepted back by her people? Would they recognize the strength she had gained from everything she had endured? Or would she face more judgment and rejection? "I won't forget what you've done for me," Ayanna said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though there was an underlying sadness to it. "You saved me, John. You gave me a chance to be myself again. I'll always be grateful for that." John smiled gently, his heart heavy with emotion. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I just did what I thought was right. You're a strong person, Ayanna. I'm proud of you." She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, they packed up their small camp in silence, knowing that their time together was coming to an end. Ayanna had made her decision, and John would support her in whatever way he could. He would walk with her for a short distance, but after that, she would have to continue alone. As they walked through the trees toward the clearing where Ayanna's tribe was located, John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for her. She had faced so many challenges, and now, she was stepping into the future, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. It was clear that she was no longer the frightened girl he had first met. She was someone new, someone stronger. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Ayanna stopped and turned to him. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "This is where we part ways," she said quietly. "Thank you for everything, John. I'll always remember you." John placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent, reassuring squeeze. "Take care of yourself, Ayanna. I believe in you." With one last lingering look, Ayanna turned and began to walk toward the village. John watched her for a moment, his heart full of emotion, before he turned and began walking back into the forest, leaving her behind. Though it was hard, John knew that it was the right thing to do. Ayanna had come to him when she needed help, and he had given her the strength to face her past. Now, it was her time to walk her own path. As he made his way through the forest, John felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that, no matter what happened, Ayanna was going to be all right. She was strong. She had survived so much, and now she had the power to shape her own future. And for that, John was proud.